the front line is in Australia's front yard. There's been a sense, why are we in Asia fighting to support this European and North American powers' hegemony?
Australia, a key ally of the West in the South Pacific. Since gaining independence, Australia has become a vital military partner for the United States. Amid rising tensions in the South China Sea and over Taiwan, Australia's role is more crucial than ever. Recently, its deepening ties with the U.S. have echoed from Canberra to Beijing to Washington.
As China fans out, in a way like Japan did in 1941-42, Australia's geography becomes really important.
How has Australia's international presence evolved since World War II? How does it navigate its own interests alongside those of the United States? And what role does it play in the complex geopolitics of the South China Sea?
For most of its history, Australia had the luxury, with the exception of the Japanese attack in World War II, they really had the luxury in Australia of deciding when and where to fight.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, is Australia the new superpower of the South? Joining us today is Dr. Michael Green. Dr. Green is Professor and Chief Executive Officer at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney, and former Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggett, President of Network 2020.
So, Dr. Green, could you just set the stage for us a little bit? And I realize that this is a big question, but we'd love to just hear a little bit about how Australia's strategic thinking has evolved since the Cold War to today's current crises. And basically just to get a better understanding of how Australia views its role in the region and how that's evolved over the past few decades.
Sure, I'm very happy to do it. Australia is far away from the United States, far away from the original mother country, Great Britain, but has historically been keenly attuned to the larger preservation of an open order, guaranteed until 1942 by Britain, and after that largely by the United States. And the Australians, before they were even a federation, when they were still 5 separate colonies, sent volunteers to fight in the Boer War in South Africa to support the British Empire. The Australian capital, Canberra, was built in a area that was outside of Russian naval gunfire ranges in the early 20th century, because not that Russia had anything against Australia, but Russia was, of course, a fierce rival of Great Britain. And then in World War I, famously, Australia sent many volunteer divisions to fight for the British in Mesopotamia and the Middle East, and famously on the Western Front, and Gallipoli in Turkey. And that Gallipoli fight in 1915 really defined Australia in many ways as a nation, in both positive and negative ways. For many, many generations afterwards, until pretty recently, young Australians would do their overseas adventure. They'd travel around the world and end up in Gallipoli, because that was such a quintessential part of Australia. And Anzac Day, Australian New Zealand Army Corps Day, is probably the most patriotic holiday in Australia. But it has a flip side too. Many looked at the 1915 Battle of Gallipoli as evidence that Australia should be very careful not to be caught up in the big wars of Britain, or now America, and not be entrapped in the imperial power and pursue its own identity as an Asian power, separate from Britain, separate from America. In 2015, the former Prime Minister Paul Keating gave the centennial Gallipoli speech at the Australian War Memorial, and he basically said, the diggers, the Australian troops, went over the top and died for the British 100 years ago, and now they're going to end up fighting in Taiwan for the Americans. We should separate from America, get closer to China and Asia. So that Gallipoli experience was formative, but it's interpreted in 2 different ways. With the U.S., Australia has always had quite intimate relations, beginning over 200 years ago when American whalers began calling on Australia and New Zealand for fresh water and food. There's a beautiful hike near Sydney at a place called America Bay, which was where the whalers would stop to get fresh water from the freshwater stream and waterfall. And that history goes for over 200 years. The first time American troops went into combat in the Western Front in World War I was on July 4th, 1918, at the Battle of Hamel, under General Monash, the Australian general, Prussian Australian Jewish general, who was the first to introduce what later would be blitzkrieg, airplanes, tanks, and troops. And the Americans hadn't been in combat yet, but an Illinois National Guard unit, a regiment in the American Army, wanted to get in the fight. And General Pershing said, "We will not fight under the British. We are not part of the British Army. We will not fight under the British." So the Americans from Illinois figured, well, the Australians are colonists like us, so we can fight under them. So they went into battle with the Australians the first day, and Pershing found out and he was furious. And he said, no American boys in American uniforms are going into the fight under the British or the Australians. So the next day, a bunch of the Americans from Illinois borrowed uniforms from the Australians and went in again. And the Australians have been in pretty much every fight the US has been in since 1918. World War II, intimately together. Roosevelt wrote to Churchill a few days after Pearl Harbor and said, our most important mission in the Pacific is to stop the Japanese from advancing down Guadalcanal and cutting off Australia. And the 1st Marine Division was sent in, fought in Guadalcanal, landed in Melbourne, right off the battlefield, right out of the ships, right onto the cricket pitch in Melbourne. If you've seen the HBO series The Pacific, there's a great scene where they're all in their cots out in the open in the cricket pitch, the entire 1st Marine Division covered in bloody, dirty dungarees. And one of them said, the hell with this. And they went down to they walked down to downtown Melbourne into the pubs. Almost 1,000 Australians went home with the 1st and 2nd Marine Division as war brides. Long history, Korea, Vietnam. The Brits did not fight in Vietnam with us. The Australians did. Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So the first thing to understand about Australian strategic thinking is the big power, the big maritime power, first the British, then the Americans, are critical to Australia's security. And that comes with a double-edged sword, because since 1915, since the Boer War, really, there's been a sense, why are we Australians in Asia fighting to support this European and North American powers hegemony? So there's been a bit of that. About 15%, 15% of Australians oppose the alliance with the US, though, and the overwhelming majority support it. And when Australians are asked in our surveys, would you support joining the Americans to defend Taiwan, 51% say yes. That is about the same number of Americans who say we should go in the first place. If you talk to senior Australian officials in private, they'll say we can't imagine that the US would fight anywhere in this region and Australia wouldn't help. But it's complicated, as I noted. What's really shifted is that for most of its history, Australia had the luxury, with the exception of the Japanese attack in World War II, they really had the luxury in Australia of deciding when and where to fight, and time to get ready and time to pick where they plug in. What's different really today is that the front line is in Australia's front yard. China is expanding its military footprint and its gray zone pressure and coercion across the region, including against Australia. China embargoed Australian exports of wine and lobster and coal and barley and wheat. The Australians stood firm. The Chinese have started lifting the embargo, but that was a real watershed moment for most Australians, that China is not just a threat to the neighborhood, but a direct challenge to Australia. The Australian Defence Ministry Department, until a few years ago, held that it had 10 years warning time. It had 10 years to get ready for any threat to the Australian homeland. 3 years ago, they changed that to say we have essentially no warning time. China is trying to build submarine bases in the Pacific Islands right near Australia. China's building bases across the Indian Ocean, and Australia is against both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So the big change now is Australia's in the front lines. There's no luxury to pick when and where. that makes this fear of entrapment all the more acute for people in Australia who don't want to be with the British or the Americans. And it makes all the more dramatic and compelling AUKUS, which is this agreement Australia designed and struck with the US and Great Britain to build the most advanced submarines, first Virginia-class attack subs from the US, and then a new class being designed in Britain, to give Australia control of its maritime approaches to defend itself against China. The complication is that China is Australia's largest trading partner, by far. And so there's a comedy show here called Utopia, which has a scene where the Australian admirals and generals are saying, we need to build up our Navy. Why? To defend our sea lanes and trade. Why? To fight our largest trading partner. It's obviously somewhat illogical until you step back and realize what China's doing in the entire region. So all of that makes it very, very interesting, very complicated. The vast majority of Australians support the alliance. A narrow majority now supports the submarine deal. When Australians are asked, is China a threat? The numbers are similar to what Americans say. 70–80% say yes. When Australians are asked, do you want to cut off trade with China? They say, hell no. Because trade with China and the rest of Asia has made Australia a very wealthy and comfortable country to live in. So it's a complicated situation. It's fascinating to be here now. And I'm pretty confident we'll sort it all out. There are some bumps in the road. The US election gets a lot of attention here, makes a lot of people nervous for reasons you'll understand. Australia has its own challenges. It's not a big country, 26 million people. So getting the workforce to build AUKUS and so forth, to fill the defense forces is a challenge. But on the whole, I'm pretty optimistic. And just to end by saying, I was in, every January I go to Hawaii, and the Indo-Pacific Command has me serve as the moderator for the meeting of all the US ambassadors from East Asia and South Asia, from, Pakistan and Afghanistan to Palau, and including India and Japan and everyone in between. And when the ambassadors talk and the admirals and generals in the Indo-Pacific Command talk over those 2.5 days and list all the problems, there's only two countries that are always part of the solution, Australia and Japan, every time, Australia and Japan. So we really need Australia, and we're lucky to have them. So I'll end on that.
Right, terrific, thank you. That's a fantastic introduction. I'd like to just stick on AUKUS for a little bit. Could you just dig into a little bit more about how it was formed? I know you said Australia was the one that presented the idea, but I'd love to just hear your take on what it really means for US-Australia relations and the extent to which the collaboration extends beyond the military, and how might that involve, say, the private sector in both the Australia and the US.
So AUKUS was announced a little over 2 years ago. It has two pillars. So one pillar is for the US and Britain to help Australia develop world-class nuclear-powered attack submarines. And as I said, there will probably be 4 to 6 US Virginia class, which is currently our most advanced, the US Navy's most advanced attack sub, which will be built in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Virginia, and delivered to Australia. And then after that, something like 5 or 6 AUKUS class, which is a design that the British are developing for their next generation, which will largely be led by the Brits. That's called Pillar 1 of AUKUS, the submarines. There's a lot more to it. For example, the US Navy will start sending US Virginia-class subs to visit ports in Western Australia, and that will give the Australian government, the Australian Navy, the experience supporting a nuclear-powered submarine, but also gives the US more presence in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, South Pacific. So Pillar 2 of AUKUS is advanced technology. And that one involves developing new emerging technologies that can be applied to the battlefield of the future. So the US and Britain and Australia are working on hypersonics. So missiles and projectiles that go faster than the speed of sound. Also work on artificial intelligence, quantum. Australia has a very strong research capability in quantum physics and applied materials. That second one is a little less formed and is a little broader. It's big and it's massively complicated, but you know what goes into a nuclear-powered submarine. The second one is a little bit open-ended. The three governments, U.S., Britain, Australia, have identified the areas they're interested in. Universities and the private sector will have to play a big role because much of the technology, emerging technology for AI, quantum, is in the private sector. It's going a little slower. It has huge promise, and there's a lot of interest, but it's going a little slower because the government, particularly in Australia, the Defense Department has less experience working with innovators. The Pentagon for about 10 years, and the British in their own way, have created, there's a thing called Defense Innovation Unit, and the Pentagon has set up its own venture capital funds. They tried 10, 12 years ago. They went to Silicon Valley and they said, "Hi, we're the US government. We're here to help. Can you please give us your advanced technology?" And Silicon Valley said, whatever you say in Silicon Valley, that means no. And so the Pentagon retreated. They hired people from Silicon Valley who were reserve officers, created these venture capital funds, and went back into Silicon Valley. And they've had some success getting advanced technologies accelerated into the Pentagon. Australia has much less experience, but it has huge potential. So that's sort of the area where people are most interested, where the least is happening still. So that's the idea. There's a lot of criticism of AUKUS from the left in Australia. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating. So the left hates AUKUS. Most Australians support it. Industry's very interested. The Labour Party and the coalition, the opposition coalition, are all in for AUKUS. And on the US side, it has very strong bipartisan support. Australia has sunk $3 billion into US, or committed $3 billion to US shipyards. And the US has committed $13 billion to build up. Why? Because as the PLA Navy and China's military fans out across the Pacific and East Asia, it's very dangerous to be above the water. But undersea, experts estimate the US and our closest allies have about a 15-year lead over China in the stealthy nuclear-powered undersea capabilities that make it very dangerous for China to try to operate above the water, and very dangerous for China to think it can do things like invade Taiwan or blockade Japan or the Philippines, because nuclear-powered submarines can range at long distances for as long as they want, 6-7 months normally, because the only thing they run out of is food. They generate their own water and oxygen. And so it's a huge asymmetrical advantage, very big and complicated, but a huge advantage for Australia. And I'll say, really, it's interesting because the Australian government 12 years ago was interested in Virginia-class submarines and concluded there was no way that the Australian public would accept nuclear power, or that the US Navy and the American government would transfer nuclear technology, propulsion technology to Australia. And all of that has happened. And the reason is China. The problem is just too big for old obstacles to survive.
Thank you. It strikes me that Australia has a very interesting role to play, both as a country that is on the front lines, as you say, and that also has such a strong trade relationship with China. What role are they playing diplomatically behind the scenes between the U.S. and China, and in terms of just trying to steer things in a direction that is what I would assume everyone wants, which is ultimately non-confrontational?
So Australia is really at the center of a bunch of diplomatic networks that matter a lot to the U.S. Australia is a member of Five Eyes. Five Eyes are the US, Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. These are the five, English-speaking allies who have been on the same side since World War II. You could argue World War I, certainly in the Cold War, and set up an arrangement during and after World War II so that we share almost everything. Signals intelligence, satellite intelligence, human intelligence. the Five Eyes is a trusted network of 5 countries where we share the most critical intelligence with each other. Australia is, with New Zealand, much more plugged into the Pacific Islands than the US is. And the US is pretty influential in the Northern Marianas, Palau, and the islands near Guam and Hawaii, many of which are in compacts with the US where we provide security and economic assistance. But in Melanesia, north of Australia and New Zealand and east of North Australia and New Zealand, it's Australia and New Zealand has outsized influence. It's diplomatic, it's economic aid, it's rugby, huge churches, vacationing to Fiji, I mean, huge ties. China is more and more present. China tried to build a submarine base in Vanuatu 6 years ago. So Australia is very plugged into the Pacific Island Forum and has alongside New Zealand. The US is getting up and setting up more embassies, but it's Australia's patch, and they've been very, very focused and connected. Australia has outstanding relations with Japan, has a security, not a treaty, but a security agreement with Japan to do a lot more together, and they do. The most high-end advanced exercises the US does in East Asia with Japan and Australia, and then separately with Korea on the Korean Peninsula. But at sea, it's Australia, Japan. And so Australia is very plugged in. One of the interesting things is how Australia could be more plugged in. And, the G7 used to be the G5, now the G7, led by the US with Britain, Canada, France, Italy, and Germany, has only one country from Asia, and that's Japan. And the G7, I can tell you from my 5 years in the White House, the G7 is kind of the conning tower for global order. The G7 tends to come up with the big initiatives on development and economics. It's not the only forum. There's the UN, there's the G20, and so forth, but it's the most intimate in terms of having like-minded leaders of major economies in the room. So recently, CSIS in Washington, where I still have, I'm the Kissinger chair at CSIS still. The CSIS did a study of the G7 agenda. So what are all the things the G7, Britain, Canada, Germany, France, et cetera, Italy, work on across trade and security and economics? And so Ned asks exactly the right question in the chat. What role is South Korea? So CSIS took that agenda from the G7 and they added up what countries are doing what to advance that agenda. So number one is the US, number two is Britain. And then before you get to Italy or Canada, or France or Germany, the countries that are doing the most to advance the G7 agenda are Australia and Korea. So CSIS is putting out a report saying Australia and Korea ought to be in the G7, balance it more to the Indo-Pacific, and get countries in there that are actually putting their money up and their diplomacy up to make a difference. It probably won't happen because the thing with these groupings is it has to be a consensus-based thing, and the Italians and the French and Germans are not going to agree to let 2 Asian countries in all likelihood. So maybe it takes form of observership, but it gives you an idea how important Australia's diplomacy is, not just regionally, but globally, which is pretty impressive on the whole. So yeah, quite diplomatically important. Americans know that. American support for alliances, especially with Australia, is at all-time highs in polls now. When Americans are asked why do we support alliances, that has shifted. It used to be Americans said, well, because it's our job to protect countries around the world. Now, the main reason Americans support alliances in polls is because those alliances with Australia, Japan, Korea, and NATO make the US safer. Americans know it's a dangerous world out there and we need allies. And I think there's a strong sense in the public that Australia is at the top of the list, but almost nobody knows why. Almost nobody knows why. There's 2 universities in the US that have Australia studies, Georgetown and UT Austin. It's quite amazing actually how important Australia is and how little. There's one think tank, I raised the money for it, CSIS, that has an Australia program. So considering how important Australia is, it's remarkable how few people understand. Great for me in April, because we're now leading Australia experts, but.
Thank you. And you mentioned a little bit about how, 12 years ago, Australia was, thinking, oh, it would be wonderful to have these submarines. And now look at what AUKUS is allowing. I'd love just to hear a little bit more about how Australia is expanding its other military capabilities over the past decades and sort of what premium they're placing on that versus economic or diplomatic initiatives, particularly vis-a-vis China.
Well, it's a tough one if you're in the Defense Department in Australia, because the Australian defense budget's growing. They just announced a big increase in the shipbuilding in the Navy, but basically it's growing at about the speed of inflation, so it's not growing. And personnel costs, as in the US, are going up. And they don't have enough people. The numbers I've heard, something like 7,000 people short of billets in the Australian military, which is smaller than the US Marine Corps. So they have some very tough choices. For decades, they had a well-balanced force. They had submarines, they had jet fighters, they had artillery, they had tanks. 2 years ago, year before last, the new Labor government commissioned a defense strategic review to look at whether the force was right for the threat. And the defense strategic review concluded that the Australian defense forces are not fit for purpose. They're not set up for the right fight. They're set up to send armored brigades to North Africa or the Middle East to help, Winston Churchill or George Herbert Walker Bush, not to deal with an air and maritime threat from China and a ballistic missile threat in the Western and Southern Pacific. So the Defense Strategic Review said we have to restructure, and it's been very, very painful. Basically, fewer tanks, less artillery, more submarines, especially, more frigates and Navy, and more, especially after Ukraine, but it started before Ukraine, more guided weapons, more missiles, more drones. They don't have hardly any drones right now, and they saw Ukraine and realized, we need drones. But they also, in Australia, the government's looking to be a kind of part of the arsenal of democracy, to produce missiles, not just for Australia, but eventually for Japan or the US or other friends and allies. So that's a big shift for Australia. Some people in the opposition party say there's not enough urgency. They're too lackadaisical about it. Others on the left say we have such a huge housing challenge. It's very expensive to live in Sydney. It's very hard to find housing. We have to deal with climate change. So on the left, there's criticism. So it's tough. The government, a Labor government, led by a prime minister from the left, a prime minister who was arrested for protesting at the University of Sydney, demanding more courses on Marxism, Anthony Albanese. That prime minister is championing AUKUS and a bigger Navy. You know what they say, if you're not a idealist when you're young, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative when you're old, you have no brain, or conservatives or moderates smug by reality, whatever it is. Albanese, his foreign minister, Penny Wong, also from the left of the Labor Party, are pretty hard-headed. But on the right, they get criticized for not being hard-headed enough. You'll often hear the coalition, the opposition, saying, where's the urgency? Your defense review said we have a huge challenge, but you're barely increasing defense. So very live debate.
My last question, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on how Australia, the US, and China might be able to mitigate this growing security dilemma within the Indo-Pacific, and really how Australia is trying to navigate its relationship with China, given its other alliances and its own unique position.
Well, the Australian government is on a bipartisan basis. The only opposition is from the Green Party, which is far to the left of Bernie Sanders, far, far to the left of Bernie Sanders, and so really not a player except in the noise. The two major parties, Labor and Liberal and National and the other coalition members, generally agree on the strategy, even if they disagree a bit on how much money to spend or how tough to be on China in relative terms. They generally agree on the direction. And so it's pursue AUKUS and a closer alliance with the US. I haven't mentioned one important dimension, which is what's called force posture. As China fans out, in a way like Japan did in 1941-42, Australia's geography becomes really important as the staging area, the rear area for any response. And so there is also a big move to get US Marines and Air Force rotating through Northern Australia. The Japanese and Koreans are training there as well, Canadians. So that this is all supported by a Labor government led by a prime minister who was protesting for more courses on Marxism. So pretty bipartisan. And at the same time, the Labor government, and in particular Foreign Minister Penny Wong, is pursuing what they call stabilization, trying to stabilize relations with China to get China to lift the embargoes they put on Australia. They did this, Beijing, because they were angry at Australia, the Australian prime minister, because he said there should be a UN investigation of the causes of COVID. That's what he said. And China slapped billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars of illegal embargoes on Australian exports to China to punish Australia. And the Australians held firm, but now they're in the process of getting the Chinese to lift them one at a time. So that stabilization is the other hand. So gas and brakes, if you will. There is a debate within the government about how much gas and how much brakes, how much to push back on China for human rights, how much to push back on China when the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy or Air Force does dangerous maneuvers against Australian ships in international waters. They've done that twice in the last few months, shooting sonar underwater when Australian divers were trying to repair a ship, which is very dangerous, shooting chaff into helicopter blades of an Australian helicopter on a UN mission. So how much to push back against that? How much to support Taiwan? There's quite a debate about where the balance is between a strong alliance and deterrence on the one hand, and what they call stabilization on the other. My sense is the press and the public and the parliament is starting to turn against stabilization and get frustrated that China is still disrespecting Australia, still doing dangerous moves. But that's how they're trying to maintain the balance. You'll have people on the left who say, it's 10, 15% at most in the public view, although a lot of professors at the University of Sydney who say, to hell with the Americans and the British, our future's in Asia. But that's a minority view. And it's really more about, to be honest, anti-Americanism than pro-Asianism. And then on the right, you have others who say, we should cut off the Chinese, no trade, and that's not viable either.
All right. Well, with that, thank you. I think that was
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Connor Mullen and Brian Tong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.